The lumberjack followed wagon tracks for a day. She was waiting in the snow. The axe was still in my hand when I found the first track. Not a boot print. A wheel rut, two of them, pressed deep into the mud at the edge of the creek crossing where the ice had gone soft that morning. Whoever made them had come through in the night, maybe just before the freeze thickened again, and now those ruts were half-locked in the gray crust of early December, like something the ground had swallowed and changed its mind about. I stood there with the axe because I'd been splitting since before light. That was the rhythm of it. You get up in the dark, you split. And by the time the sun has any heat in it, you've already done the work that matters. The camp I was running that winter was small, just 9 men and a cook named Arvid who smelled of lard and was mostly deaf, and the nearest settlement was Garnet Falls, which was 22 miles east and not much of a settlement to begin with. We didn't get wagon traffic out this way. The road, such as it was, went nowhere past us. There was only the tree line and the river, and beyond that the open country that rolled up into hills and kept going until you hit the Bearpaw Range. I'm telling this the way it happened, which means I'm going to back up and get ahead of myself sometimes, because that's how memory works when you're old and you've had enough cold winters to blur the edges. I'll tell it straight where I can. My name is Cord Blanchard. I was 51 years old that winter. I'd been logging since I was 16, had my own operation by 34, lost it at 46 to a business partner who I will not name here because he is almost certainly dead by now and the dead don't need my bile following them. I'd rebuilt. Smaller. 2 camps instead of 5 and one of them barely worth the name. The operation on the Bearpaw Fork was the one I actually believed in. Good timber, good crew, and a logging road I'd cut myself the previous spring. I'd been sleeping in a canvas tent with a cast-iron stove that listed to one side, and had a tendency to draw smoke back into the tent when the wind came from the northwest. I was, by any honest measure, a man who had stopped expecting much. I don't say that to sound sorry for myself. It was just the truth of where I was. You get to a certain age and you've outlived enough things, a marriage, a partnership, a version of yourself you thought was going to last, and you start organizing your life around what's manageable. I had my work. I had my axe and my saw and my men, and I had 20 cords of timber already cut and staged for the spring drive. I didn't need anything else to happen. Then I found those wheel ruts. I followed them because that's what you do. You don't leave a wagon unaccounted for in December in that country. The temperature was already dropping again after the brief false thaw, and if someone had come through in the night, they were either lost or in some kind of trouble. I told Arvid I was going to scout the South Ridge and I walked the ruts. They crossed the creek on the ice, which told me the driver had been lucky. That ice wasn't reliable, and then climbed the far bank and went south into the open meadow. The snow from 2 days before was still mostly undisturbed out there, white and flat in the gray morning light, and the tracks went right through the middle of it heading toward the tree line on the far side, about 3/4 of a mile. I walked with the axe over my shoulder because it was habit, not because I expected to need it. The wagon had gone into the trees, and then down a long slope toward a frozen pond I'd seen once before from a distance, in the fall, when I was scouting timber. The tracks went all the way to the edge of that pond and stopped. The wagon was there. One wheel had gone through the ice. Not all the way, the front left wheel had broken through and the wagon had canted sideways and stuck, and then the cold had come back and frozen it in place. A mule was hitched to it, standing very still with its head low, its breath making small clouds. The mule was alive. You could tell from the breath and from the way it shifted its weight when it heard me coming. Beside the mule, up on the bank where the snow was solid ground, there was a woman sitting on a bedroll with her back against a birch tree. She was awake. That was the first thing I registered. She was awake and watching me come down the slope. She had a blanket pulled across her shoulders and her hands folded in her lap, and she was watching me the way you watch something you've been expecting for a while and aren't sure whether to be relieved or cautious about. I stopped about 15 feet out. The ice between us looked thin and I didn't trust it. "Morning," I said. "Morning," she said back. Her voice was even, not frightened, not relieved either, just even, like a woman who had been through a long night and had arrived on the other side of it and decided to wait and see what the day brought. "Wheels in the ice," I said. "I know. How long?" She thought about it. Since about 2 in the morning, maybe a little before. So she'd been sitting there for 6 or 7 hours, in December. I looked at her more carefully. She was maybe 40, maybe a little over. Dark hair, partly loose from whatever she'd had it pinned in, frost on the ends of it. Her cheeks had that particular raw look that comes from a long night in the cold, red and tight. But her eyes were steady. Brown eyes, sharp, taking me in the way I was taking her in. "You're from the logging camp," she said. It wasn't a question. "North Fork, how'd you know about the camp?" Man in Garnet Falls mentioned it. Said there was a logging operation on the Bearpaw Fork run by a man named Blanchard. I looked at her. "And you thought you'd come out this way in December?" She didn't say anything to that. There was a reason she'd come, and she'd get to it or she wouldn't. "I need the wheel pulled out," she said. "I've got a pry bar in the wagon, but the ice is soft out there, and I couldn't get purchase." "I can see that." I looked at the mule. He'd been standing there all night. "Yes, I couldn't unhitch him in the dark without risking both of us going through. Figured morning was better." That was sound thinking. I walked the bank to the left, testing the edge of the ice with my boot, looking for where it was thickest. There was a shelf of solid ice connected to the near bank about 30 feet down from where the wagon sat, and I thought I could walk out from there and get to it from the side where the wheel had gone in. The water under that pond wasn't deep. I'd seen it in fall when it was low, maybe 4, 5 feet at the middle. Still bad enough if you went through completely, but the wagon wheel was probably only in 18 inches of water, maybe less. I went back to the bank and picked up a dead branch and walked out on the shelf ice, probing ahead of me as I went. The ice held. I got to the wagon and looked down at the wheel, which was sitting in maybe 16 inches of brownish water, the spokes locked with fresh ice around them. "Pry bar," I said. She'd gotten up and followed along the bank to a point across from me. She reached into the wagon box and handed me a long iron bar. I took it and got the flat end under the rim of the wheel and worked it. The ice cracked. The wheel shifted. The whole wagon groaned and the mule lifted its head and blew. It took 3 attempts in about 20 minutes, and by the end my boots were wet from where I'd had to kneel on the ice and water had soaked through at the knee. But the wheel came up, and I walked alongside the mule and led him forward by the bridle until the wagon was on solid ground and all 4 wheels were on snow. I stood there breathing. My knee was cold. The wet was already starting to stiffen. "Thank you," she said. She was standing closer than she'd been, looking at the wheel to make sure it wasn't cracked. It wasn't. Solid oak, just cold and wet. "You've got a ways to go," I said. "Where are you headed past here?" She looked up at me. I was heading to the camp. I waited. "My name is Delia Marsh," she said. "I've got a letter from a man named Gunderson about timber cutting rights on the South Tract. My husband held the deed. He died in October." Walter Marsh. I knew the name. He'd held a timber deed on about 400 acres of good pine on the south side of the Bearpaw, land that adjoined mine. He died in October. Arvid had heard it from the mail writer back in November. I hadn't known he had a wife. "You came out here to talk about cutting rights," I said. "In December, in the dark." "The weather was fine when I left Garnet Falls yesterday afternoon," she said. "It turned. I lost the road in the dark." She paused. "I'm not a fool, Mr. Blanchard. I made a bad calculation about the weather. It happens." She said it straight. No apology in it, no self-pity either. Just, it happened, here we are, what's next? I looked north toward the tree line where the camp was, then back at her. Her boots, I noticed, were not heavy enough for this cold. Good leather, but not enough. Her feet had to be bad. "Come to the camp," I said. Get warm. We'll talk about whatever you need to talk about once you've had something hot. She studied me for a moment. Then she nodded and went to the mule and checked his bridle without asking me for help. We walked north, her leading the mule and Wagon, me walking alongside. I offered to take the bridle and she said she had it. So I walked alongside and we didn't talk much. The sky had gone low and gray and I could smell more snow coming. The cold was getting into my wet knee something fierce, but I didn't say anything about it. What I remember from that walk is this: the sound her boots made in the crushed snow, which was different from the sound mine made, lighter. The way the mule's breath came in long visible clouds, the birch trees with their black marks standing out sharp in the white field. And I remember noticing, without making much of it at the time, that she walked like a woman who'd walked long distances before. Not a town walk, a purpose walk, like distance didn't worry her. Arvid about fell over when we came into camp. I told him to heat something and stable the mule, and I took Delia Marsh to the foreman's shack, which was mine, such as it was, and got the stove burning hot. There was a crate she could sit on, and I put a folded canvas down for her feet, and she sat, and I went to my pack and found dry wool socks. I set them on the crate next to her without saying anything. She looked at them, then she looked at me. Go ahead, I said, your feet are bad. She took her boots off with no ceremony, and her feet were in fact bad, white at the toes and mottled further up. She rubbed them for a while with her hands, and I turned away and looked at the stove and waited. After a while she got the socks on. Arvid brought coffee and something that was probably soup of some kind and didn't ask any questions, which was the most useful thing he could have done. We talked about the timber deed after she'd eaten. She laid it on the crate between us, an actual deed, signed by her husband, transferring the South Tract to him from the original land grant. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in cutting rights on the South acreage, paid per board foot, with a clause returning full deed control to her if she chose not to renew after the first season. She'd worked that clause out herself, she said. The lawyer in Garnet Falls had written it up. I read it twice. It was a fair arrangement, better than fair for her in some ways, which told me she'd thought hard about it and wasn't coming to me from desperation but from deliberate choice. Why me? I said. She picked up her coffee. Because you're here, because you know the land. Because Gunderson said you run a clean operation, you don't overcut, you don't leave a slope bare, and because you're not Hendricks. Hendricks was a timber man out of Helena who had a reputation for doing things fast and rough, and leaving the land looking like something had eaten it. You talked to Hendricks, I said. He made an offer the week after Walter died. She looked at her coffee. It was not a respectful conversation. I believed that without needing details. I said I'd need a day to walk the South acreage before I committed to anything. She said that was reasonable. I said she could stay in the foreman's shack, I'd bunk with the crew, and she could rest and get her feet right before she started back. She said she wasn't an invalid, and she'd work while she was there. She said it matter-of-factly, like it was the obvious solution and she was just stating it. I didn't argue. You learn, after a certain age, when arguing is a waste of the air. That night I lay in the crew bunk and listened to the snow come down on the canvas roof and thought about nothing in particular. Or I tried to. What actually happened was I thought about her face when she'd watched me come down the slope that morning. The way she'd been prepared. Braced, maybe, is the word. Like she'd made up her mind in the night to be all right whatever came, and then something had come and she'd held herself to that. I'd had a wife. Her name was June, and she died of a fever 11 years prior, and the grief of it had come in stages, the way grief does, the last stage being a kind of dull acceptance that I was the kind of man things happened to, not the kind of man anything happened for. I don't know exactly when I'd settled into that. Somewhere around 45, I think. It snowed hard for 2 days. Delia Marsh did not sit still. She organized the cook tent in ways that Arvid resented for about 4 hours and then accepted completely. She fixed a hinge on the supply locker that had been letting cold air in all season. She found a crack in the stovepipe collar in the crew shack and packed it with clay she'd pried out of the creek bank. My men were uncertain about her at first, and then they weren't. She didn't make a fuss about the camp or the cold or the rough conditions, and she didn't treat them like they were rough either. She just moved through the camp doing things that needed doing and talked to them like they were people, which they were, though camps like that one can make you forget it. On the second afternoon, I came back from checking the staged timber and found her in the foreman's shack at the crate, writing. She had a small journal, battered green leather, and she was writing in it with a stub of pencil. She looked up when I came in and didn't close the journal, just set the pencil down. "Feet," I said. "Better." "Good." I sat on the edge of my bunk and worked off my boots. My knee had been aching for 2 days from the cold soaking it had taken on the ice. It wasn't bad, just a long, low ache that got worse when I bent it certain ways. She was watching me. "Your knee." "It's fine." "It's not fine. You've been favoring it for 2 days. She closed the journal and stood up, and I started to say something, and she said, "Don't." Just that. "Don't," so I didn't. She went to her pack and came back with a small tin and a length of flannel cloth. She knelt down, right there on the dirt floor of that shack, and she put the flannel around my knee and bound it firmly and worked some kind of camphor salve into the cloth from the outside, just pressing it in with her palms in a slow, methodical way. It smelled sharp and clean, and the heat from her hands went into the joint like something thawing. I sat very still. She didn't say anything while she did it. Neither did I. There was just the sound of the stove and the snow on the canvas and her hands working. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked up at me, not waiting for thanks, just looking, the way she'd looked when she'd watched me come down that slope measuring, but not cold. There was something in her face that was not pity and not tenderness, and was maybe something harder than either of those things. Like she'd decided something and was satisfied with the decision. "Who taught you that?" I said. "My mother was a healer," she said. "Shoshone. My father was a trader from Ohio. I grew up knowing both kinds of knowing." She said it simply, without explanation or apology. I thought about Walter Marsh and what kind of man he'd been and whether he'd known what he had in her. I didn't say that. You don't say things like that, but I thought it. The snow stopped on the third day and the temperature dropped sharply, and I walked the south tract with Delia in the morning. She knew the timber. That surprised me, and then didn't. Of course she knew it. She'd walked that land with Walter, probably. She pointed out a stand of mature pine I'd been planning to leave for a second season, and said the root systems there were shallow, and if we had a big spring wet the whole stand could go to windthrow anyway, and she was right. I could see it once she said it, the way the ground sloped, the way the drainage would pool. We talked about it walking back. We talked about the South Creek and whether it could take the spring drive or whether we'd need to skid to the main river. She had opinions, and they were good ones, and I said so. She laughed. It was a short laugh, and it sounded like she didn't use it often, but it was real. "What?" I said. "Nothing," she said. "It's just men don't usually say that." "Say what?" "That I'm right." We walked for a while. The cold was serious now, the sky hard and pale, the snow packed underfoot. I could hear a raven somewhere in the timber, that flat, unhappy call they make when the temperature drops. "Hendricks told me I didn't understand timber," she said, "and that I should let him handle the business and take the money." "Hendricks is an idiot," I said. She laughed again, shorter this time, but real again. That evening she was going to start back for Garnet Falls in the morning, and I was going to winter the camp through to February, and we both knew that. The cutting rights agreement was on the crate between us, and I'd signed it, and she'd witnessed it herself because there was no one else to do the witnessing, and we decided it was good enough. Whether it would hold in a court, I didn't know. It felt solid to me. That counts for something between two people who have shaken hands on a thing. Arvid made a supper that was better than his usual, which I think was his way of marking the occasion, and the men were quieter than usual, which I think was the same thing. After supper, she and I sat by the stove in the foreman's shack, and she had her coffee and I had mine, and we didn't talk much. I watched the fire through the grate and thought about the South Tract and the spring drive and what it would mean to have that extra acreage in the cut. Practical things. Things that fit in my head without taking up too much room. After a while she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." The other camp you had, the one you lost." I looked at her. "Gunderson mentioned it," she said. "Not to gossip, he was explaining who you were." I thought about whether to answer. The fire popped. Outside, the camp had gone quiet. It was late. "Business partner," I said. He had a better lawyer than I did. "What happened after?" I started over. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. Smaller. Took about 4 years to get to where I could look at the operation and feel like it was mine again. She nodded. She was looking at the fire. "Walter got sick in August," she said. "By September he couldn't walk the land. He died on the 14th of October. She was quiet for a moment. "I'd been running the supply arrangement since July, keeping the books. He knew what was happening, and he made sure I knew what I needed to know before he couldn't tell me any more." She paused. "He was a careful man." "He sounds like it." "He was." She set her coffee down on the crate. I'm not lost without him. I want to be clear about that. I know what I'm doing. I know what the land is worth, and I know what I want out of this arrangement." She looked at me directly. "I just wanted you to know that I came here clear-eyed." I looked at her. "I could tell that," I said, "first morning." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once like something had been settled. She left in the morning early, before full light. I helped her hitch the mule, and she checked the traces herself, and then stood in the gray pre-dawn and looked at me. "Spring," she said. "I'll come out when the cut starts." "Road'll be better by May," I said. I wasn't worried about the road. She climbed up on the wagon seat and took the reins, and I stood back. She looked down at me one more time. In the half-dark, she looked like she had looked when I'd first seen her, sitting against that birch tree, not frightened, not helpless, just settled. A woman who'd made her calculations and was satisfied with them. "Mr. Blanchard," she said. "Cord," I said. She considered that. "Cord," a pause. "Thank you for the socks." Then she drove out of camp, and I stood there until I couldn't hear the wagon anymore. I went inside and sat on the bunk and looked at the crate where the signed agreement was folded and sitting under my tobacco pouch so it wouldn't move. The stove was still warm. The socks she'd borrowed were folded neatly on the corner of the crate. That was December. What happened in the months between December and May is the kind of thing that happens when you're wintering a logging camp. Hard work, long cold, a kind of frozen sameness punctuated by problems that have to be solved. One of my men, a Finn named Pavo, broke his collarbone in February when a skid chain let go, and I splinted it myself the way I'd been taught and kept him in camp on light work until he could use the arm again. That was a bad week. Pavo was my best faller, and with him on light work I was short a man in the tree, which meant I was doing more of the felling myself, which at 51, and with a bad knee from the ice pond, was not ideal, but was what there was to do. The main skid road iced over in January, so bad we had to recut it up the ridge. That was 4 days of hard labor in cold that was 20 below by morning, and the men did it without complaint, which told me something about the crew I had. Arvid's hearing got worse, and by March he was mostly reading lips, which was not ideal but workable. He started leaving written notes on the cook tent wall for things like meal times and supply counts, and the men took to adding things to the list, small jokes mostly, things they knew he'd read and not hear, and Arvid would read the list every morning and cross off the legitimate entries and leave the jokes there without comment, which was its own kind of answer. I thought about Delia Marsh some, not obsessively. I'm not a man who obsesses. But she was there in my mind the way a good piece of timber is there. You find yourself thinking about it, calculating it, seeing what it might become. I'd catch myself in the middle of something else entirely, sharpening a saw, reading a chain count, watching the Skid Road crew work the New Ridge route, and she'd come into the thought without being invited. Not the image of her exactly, more like the fact of her, the weight of her in the world, if you know what I mean. The way certain things are real and substantial, and stay real after they leave the room. I thought about her hands on my knee, the steadiness of it, the fact that she'd just done it without asking because it needed doing, and because she wasn't going to watch a person be in pain on account of manners. There was no performance in it, no look what I'm doing. She'd knelt on the dirt floor of that shack and worked the camphor into the cloth and done the job, and that was all. I had not been tended to in that plain, unceremonious way since June died. I hadn't known I missed it until it happened again. I thought about her laugh, the short one, the real one, the way it came out of her like something that had been waiting and then just came, quick, before she could think better of it. I liked that laugh. I thought about it more than I should have in the course of a hard winter, is what I'm telling you. I wrote to Garnet Falls once in February to the postmaster there, asking him to pass word to Mrs. Marsh that the South Tract access looked favorable and spring cut would begin on schedule. That was a legitimate business communication, and I maintained that, though I did rewrite it twice before sending it. She wrote back in March, 2 sentences. The first confirmed she'd received the message and that she would arrange to come out in May when the cut started. The second sentence said she hoped the winter had been manageable. I read those 2 sentences about 4 times and then folded the letter and put it under the tobacco pouch on the crate, which was where the signed agreement lived. They kept each other company through the rest of the winter. I thought about her laugh, the short one, the real one. In April, the snow started pulling back from the south faces, and I started the crew on the South Tract. New ground, good timber, and the slope fell naturally toward the creek, which made the skidding easier than I'd had it in years. I'd walked the acreage twice in February through the deep snow, just to know the ground, and I'd laid out the cut sequence in my head over the winter so that by the time April came and we could work the ground, I had a clear idea of what needed to happen and in what order. Good timber is a particular kind of pleasure. I don't know if that sounds right, but it's true. When you've spent your life reading trees, the way they grow, how the root systems sit, where the light comes from, what the soil underneath tells you about what's above, you develop something for a good stand. Not sentiment exactly, more like the feeling a craftsman gets when the material is right. The South Tract was right. The pine was mature and straight, and the undergrowth was clean, and the drainage lines were where you'd want them. Delia had known it when she'd pointed out that windthrow risks stand in December, and she'd been right that taking it early was better than losing it to a wet spring. She'd walked that land and read it. By the first week of May, we had a good head of logs in the creek, and were waiting on the water to rise for the drive. She came on a Tuesday. I heard the wagon before I saw it coming up the new road I'd cut from the south. It was a good road. I'd taken some pains with it. She drove into the clearing where we were staged and tied off the mule and climbed down and stood looking at the cut. About 40 acres of it visible from where she stood, the slash piles and the skid marks and the stacked timber along the creek bank. Clean, she said. That's how I run it. She walked the creek bank and I walked with her, and she counted the logs in the water and did the math in her head, and told me the board-foot estimate she came up with, and it was within 2% of mine. You walked it, I said. Last week, before I came. She looked at me with something like amusement. I wanted to know what I was coming to see. We went over the accounts at the tailgate of her wagon. She'd brought a ledger. I'd brought mine. The numbers matched where they needed to match and differed where they needed to differ, meaning we'd both done the work independently and had come to the same honest place. We shook hands. She had a firm grip. I'd expected that. Supper, I said. You can start back in the morning. The road's better, but it's a long drive back in the dark. She tilted her head like she was considering the wisdom of that. Then she said yes. Arvid was in better spirits than he'd been all winter. He made biscuits. I don't know where the biscuits came from. We'd been out of the white flour since March, but he made them, and they were good, and the crew ate better than they had in weeks. Pavel sat at the end of the bench and ate 3 biscuits and looked at Delia with the straightforward admiration of a man who associates the arrival of good food with a particular person and sees no reason to hide it. She caught his eye and said something to him in what I thought was Finnish, and he sat up straight and said something back with more syllables than I'd ever heard out of him at once. "You speak Finnish," I said to her later. "A little. My father traded up into the northern territories. You pick things up." She looked into the fire. "I told him the biscuits were very good." "What did he say?" "He said his mother made better ones, and that no offense was intended to me personally." "That sounds like Paavo." She smiled. Not the short laugh, a smile, slow and real, by firelight. It went into my chest like the camphor had gone into my knee. After supper the crew found reasons to be elsewhere, the way men do when they sense something is occurring that doesn't include them. Pavel gave me a look on his way out of the cook tent that I chose to ignore, though it was a harder thing to ignore than I would have liked. We sat by the fire that Arvid had built outside because the evening was clear and the temperature had come up enough to make it comfortable. Stars coming on thick and cold. The creek sound under everything, higher and faster now with the snowmelt. The smell of pine sap and cold water and the turned earth of the south slope. I told her about Paavo's collarbone. She asked what the skid chain failure was, bad link or bad attachment point, and I told her bad link, and she said the outfitter in Garnet Falls had been selling substandard chain for 2 years, and she'd told him so and he'd argued with her about it, and she'd stopped buying from him. I said that was useful to know, and that I'd been buying from the same outfitter. She said she'd introduce me to a supplier in Great Falls who charged a little more and whose chain didn't fail. I told her about the skid road icing over and the decision to cut the ridge route. She said the ridge route was probably better in the long run for the second season timber anyway because the slope angles were easier. She was probably right. I told her about Arvid's notes on the cook tent wall, the jokes the men left. She listened and nodded and then looked into the fire for a moment and said, "Men do that. When they respect a place, they make small marks on it." She said it quietly, like she was thinking something through. "It means they're not leaving." I thought about that. "You think they'll stay?" "The ones who matter will." She didn't look at me when she said it, just the fire. We talked until the fire burned low. Neither of us tried to make it something it wasn't. We just talked about the land and the work and the things that had happened in the winter, and it was the easiest conversation I'd had in I didn't know how long. A very long time. I kept noticing that. The ease of it. Like 2 people who have worked the same ground in different seasons, and are comparing what they found. When the fire was down to coals, she looked at it for a while without talking. Then she said, "I'm going to extend the cutting rights agreement." I figured. 2 more seasons, same terms. "All right." She turned and looked at me. The firelight was mostly gone and the starlight was doing the work now, and in that light her face was serious and plain and not difficult to look at. "I'd like to come out in the fall," she said, "before the winter closes the road." I looked at the coals. "That would be all right," I said. There was a moment of quiet, just the creek and the cooling fire. "You're a careful man, Cord Blanchard," she said. It wasn't a complaint. She said it the way you'd say something true, not building toward anything, just saying it. "I've had to be," I said. "I know," she was quiet again, "so have I." We sat there for a while longer. The coals went gray. Before she went asleep, she stopped at the door of the shack. I'd given her the foreman's shack again. It was the obvious thing, and she turned and looked at me. In the dark, she put her hand on the door frame and just looked at me, direct, the way she had that first morning across the iced pond. I was glad you came, she said, that morning. I thought about her sitting against that birch tree in the dark for 6 or 7 hours in the cold, waiting, staying, not giving up, not panicking, not falling into pieces. Just deciding she was going to be all right and holding herself to that until something better arrived. I was glad too, I said. She nodded and went inside. I stood there for a moment in the dark, by the dead fire, with the stars overhead and the creek going on, and the smell of pine coming down off the south slope, where my timber was staged and ready, and the season was beginning. I was 51 years old and I had rebuilt something worth having, and there was a woman sleeping in that shack who had come out in December in the dark across ice. She didn't know and waited 6 hours in the cold and then sat down and shaken hands and told me plainly that she knew what she was doing, and she'd proved it, and she was coming back in the fall. A man gets to a certain age and the surprises thin out. You stop expecting them. Then one comes. I put my boot on the last of the coals to kill the spark and walked down to the creek and stood there in the dark for a while listening to it. The water was high and cold and moving fast, and it would take the logs just fine. Spring drive in a week, maybe 2. Good season ahead. The south tract opened up. A woman who knew the land and ran her own numbers and would come back in the fall. I stood there for a while, just that. Then I went to bed. In the fall she came back, as she'd said she would, this time before the cold set in late September. The aspens already yellow, the days short and the light going gold and thin in the afternoons. She drove in on the road I'd been improving all summer, which was better than it had been and would be better still by next year. I'd been working on it in the spare hours between the spring drive end and the start of the fall prep, which was not a lot of spare hours, but I'd worked on it. She noticed. She noticed because she paid attention to things like that, and because she'd come over that road enough times now to know what it had been. You regraded the south crossing, she said when she climbed down. Last month, the drainage was wrong. She looked at the crossing, then at me. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. We walked the south tract in the morning, in that September light that has a particular quality in that country, lower and more golden than summer, everything slightly more defined, the shadows longer and sharper, the air carrying just the start of cold in it. She walked in front of me on the narrow trail through the second growth and pointed out a cluster of young pine that had come up thick where we'd cleared the year before. New growth, maybe 18 inches tall, dense and healthy. You seeded these, she said. Yes. She stood looking at them for a moment. I'd scattered seed on the slash ground the previous fall, a thing I'd started doing at the old operation before I lost it and had kept doing because it seemed right. It cost nothing but the seed and the time, and in 10 or 15 years you had something worth having again. She turned and looked at me. Hendricks doesn't do that. No, I said, he doesn't. She turned back to the trees. Walter would have liked this, she said. Not to me exactly, just out loud. I didn't say anything to that because there was nothing to say. I stood and let her have the moment, whatever it was. She came with the ledger and we settled the second payment and walked the south tract again to plan the second season cut. She had ideas about which stands to take and which to leave, and I had ideas, and where they differed we argued it out and came to something better than either of us had started with. That's the best kind of argument. She pushed back hard on a section I wanted to cut in the first pull, and made a case for leaving it for the second season based on the root moisture she'd observed in the soil at the base of the trees. I thought she was wrong and said so, and we went and looked at the soil together and she was not wrong. We sat at the tailgate of her wagon in the afternoon light, and she went over her ledger and I went over mine, and the numbers were straight, and she closed the ledger and looked out at the tree line and said that the south tract had another good 15 years in it if we managed it right. I said I agreed. 3 more seasons after this, I said, if you want. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about something. I waited. I've been thinking, she said. about whether it makes more sense to keep running this as two separate operations or whether there's a simpler arrangement. A partnership, I said. Yes. I looked at the tree line. The aspens were brilliant in the late sun, yellow going to orange at the edges. A partnership. That word had cost me the last time I'd used it. I'd rebuilt for 4 years because of that word used wrong. I said you'd want it drawn up properly, not a handshake. I'd want it drawn up by my lawyer, she said. Not Gunderson, a woman in Helena who knows what she's doing. I looked at her. She was looking at the aspens. Her jaw was set in that way it had. The way I'd been seeing it for nearly a year now, and had come to understand meant she'd already thought this through, and was waiting to see if I'd catch up. Personal or business, I said quietly. She turned and looked at me. In the afternoon light, her eyes were very dark and steady. Both, she said, if you want both. The aspens rustled. The creek made its sound below us. A late hawk crossed the open sky above the tree line. I heard it before I saw it, and then it was gone. I thought about what I was at 52. A man who'd lost things and rebuilt things and was still standing and had his operation and his crew and his integrity and a good cut of timber staged for the drive, and not much else. A man who'd been, for the last several years, essentially alone in the way that doesn't announce itself but just settles in around you, the way snow settles, until you can't remember a time without it. I'd organized my life around it. Made my peace, as people say, though I think what they usually mean is that they stopped fighting something they couldn't change. And I thought about what she was, a woman who'd sat against a birch tree in the dark for 6 hours in December cold, and decided she was going to be all right, and had been. A woman who'd come to a logging camp in the middle of winter with a deed and a ledger and a clear head and shaken my hand, and looked at my numbers and told me plainly that she knew what she was doing, and then proved it over the course of a year, on the ground, in the timber, in every conversation we'd had. A woman who'd seeded this moment the same way I'd seeded that slash ground, quietly, practically, without ceremony, thinking about what might grow. I looked at her hand on the tailgate. Small, work-worn, with a scar across the first knuckle of her right index finger that she'd gotten, she'd told me once, from a maul that slipped when she was 14 and helping her father split fence posts. Competent hands. Hands that had bound my knee in the dark and turned the pages of a ledger and pointed out what was wrong with the soil at the base of those trees and been right. I said I want both. She held my gaze for a long moment. A moment that had its own weight, its own texture, the way certain moments do when you're old enough to know what they mean and to not waste them by looking away. Then she reached out and put her hand over mine where it was resting on the tailgate. Not a squeeze, just a placing, warm and steady and still, the way her hands always were, doing exactly what needed doing and nothing more and nothing less. I turned my hand over and held hers. We sat like that for a while in the afternoon light with the aspens going gold around us and the creek running below and the hawk somewhere gone over the ridge. I didn't try to say anything. She didn't either. Sometimes the right thing is just to sit with what you've said and let it be real. After a while she said, "I'll write to the lawyer." "All right," I said. "Before the snow." "Good." She looked at the tree line. I looked at it too. The light was going lower now, the gold getting thinner, and the shadows of the aspens were long across the snow that was still in the north-facing folds of the slope. "I should stay the night," she said. "It's late to start back." "That's practical," I said. "Yes," she said. And I thought I heard the very edge of something in her voice, something dry and satisfied, like the short laugh but quieter, like she was pleased with the economy of things. That's most of what there is to say. We had the papers drawn up in January by her lawyer in Helena, who was indeed a woman and who indeed knew what she was doing. Her name was Margaret Alcott, and she had a small office above a dry goods store and a filing system that appeared chaotic and was in fact perfect, as I discovered when she produced a specific document from a specific drawer inside of 30 seconds when I questioned a clause. She gave me a look over the top of her glasses when she handed me the final document that I think was meant to tell me she was watching, and that suited me fine. I had no intention of ever being the man with the better lawyer again, in either direction. I signed where she pointed. Delia signed next to me. Her signature was larger than mine and more deliberate, each letter clearly formed. I watched her write it. It occurred to me, watching her write her name on that page, that she had been signing things alone for a year and a half, since October when Walter died, signing as the sole party the only name, and that now her name had mine beside it, and that she'd chosen that deliberately with full consideration, the way she chose everything. Margaret Alcott notarized the document and set it in a folder and handed the folder to Delia, not to me, which was also correct. By the second spring we were running the north and south tracks together, and the operation was the largest I'd had since before the partnership that broke me, and it was cleaner and better, and it was ours. Pavo stayed. So did most of the crew. Arvid retired that second spring to his sister's house in Helena, and we found a new cook who was not as good as Arvid but was younger and could hear, which had practical advantages. The new road to the South Tract was graded right by the third year, smooth enough that Delia could drive it in spring mud without the wagon fighting her at every crossing. She moved her things to the camp in March, before the mud season, which she said was the logical time because the road was worst in April, and there was no sense making 2 trips. That was how she did things, logical, direct, no ceremony for its own sake, just what made sense. I had built a better shack by then, with a real floor and a stove that didn't list, and a window I'd framed in myself on the south wall so there was afternoon light in it. We lived in it. The first morning she was there with all her things and we were drinking coffee and she had her ledger open on the table and I was looking at a chain tally and it was just an ordinary morning. There was nothing notable about it. The stove was going. The light came in the south window. She had her pencil and I had mine, and outside the camp was starting up with its morning sounds, boots on frozen ground, the cookfare catching, Pavo's voice saying something in Finnish that made one of the younger men laugh. An ordinary morning. I sat with that ordinary morning and felt what it was worth. I'm 73 years old now as I'm telling this. 22 years ago a wheel went through the ice, and I found a woman sitting against a birch tree in the cold, waiting. She waited because that was what the situation called for. She bound my knee because that was what the situation called for. She shook my hand and looked at my numbers and came back in the fall and said both, just like that, both, clear as water, because that was what the situation called for. There are men who need to be the only capable one in the room. I was never that man, not exactly, but I will say that somewhere around 45, I'd stopped believing that anyone would find me worth the trouble of being capable alongside. That's the thing she changed, if changed is the right word. She didn't rescue me from some cliff. She just showed up in December, across ice she didn't know in the dark, and then showed up again, and she was there and steady and she looked at me straight and said both. That's a word I've thought about for 22 years. 2 letters, both, said in the afternoon light with the aspens going gold and her hand over mine on the tailgate. I'm looking at her right now. She's at the table with the ledger, she still keeps the books. She's better at it than I am and we both know it. And the afternoon light is coming through the south window, our window, and her hair has gray in it now that wasn't there before. And she is entirely herself, not a bit different in the ways that matter, and she is here. She looked up just now and saw me looking at her. She tilted her head a little, the way she does when she's deciding whether something requires a response. You're not sleeping, she said. I'm thinking. About what? I considered. About December, I said. She held my gaze. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile. Something quieter than that and more settled. Like a woman who has been somewhere for a long time and is satisfied with where she is. Go to sleep, Cord, she said. I will,